Hello all, it's Monday, which means that today I'm going to try and give you something to do. And today's might be quite tricky or difficult for you. Or maybe just something to file away and think about or do a bit of exploring about. When I came to Haxby and Wigginton as minister to the church here, and also at the same time to work alongside my colleague Judith at Central Methodist Church in the city, I think at the first service I conducted, the first time I was there, a lady walked up to me, an elderly woman, and said to me, shook my hand, looked me straight in the face and said, "Hello Rory, my name is Kath. I could die any day now, and you're going to do my funeral, and I just wanted you to know who I was when you took my funeral." And then we chatted about a few other things. And I mean, when you come into a congregation's life, you meet all kinds of interesting people. But I loved Kath's frankness about that. And I think I've talked about her in another of these videos as well. I did her funeral just a few days before we went into lockdown, and it was a wonderfully happy moment for her family, remembering someone who was just so wonderfully and fiercely alive right to the very end, whose life was an adventure until she literally, having seen her healthy on a Wednesday, just had her heart given over the next weekend, and she died. I found Kath's frankness not disturbing but wonderfully refreshing, because today I want to ask you whether you talk about death. During the coronavirus pandemic, we've obviously had a lot of conversation about staying alive, and usually when we talk about dying and death, we deal with the aftermath of that. So we talk about bereavement and we talk about grief, and we recommend counseling and conversation and gentleness and carefulness for people who are feeling the loss of the death of a loved one. But we don't often talk about dying before it happens, either for ourselves or for other people. It still, I think, is the minority situation that I work pastorally with families and with people who have very open and frank conversations about dying with someone who is dying in their life, or who are able to listen well to somebody talk about their dying while they are dying, which might be something that lasts a matter of days, might be something that lasts months and months. But one of the great sadnesses of this season for me was over Easter having a conversation with someone who said to me that the thing they missed most about coming to church on Easter Sunday was receiving communion on Easter Sunday for the last time, because they are absolutely sure, based on their medical prognosis, that they will die before next Easter comes around. But they said it. See, they said it. And we could have that conversation. And I guess that's the important thing to think about today. So why talk about this? Well, partly because people are dying, partly because people are always dying, and partly because today is the beginning of the Dying Matters Awareness Week. If you've never heard of Dying Matters, it's an organization whose strapline is "Let's Talk About It." And their reason for being is to encourage us not to be afraid to talk about death, to talk about our own deaths, to talk about the deaths of other people, to sit down as families or as friends or with people that matter to us and ask for good listening, or offer good listening to each other in the midst of talking about human frailty, about human, just the fragility of our bodies and the fragility of our lives. I have a book on my shelf which I should have found. Don't even know where it is. To show you, it's a book by a guy called Atul Gawande, and it's called Being Mortal. And it is in many ways an exploration of death, of the fact of the limitedness of our human bodies, and the way that in our society, in our cultures, we do or don't make space for that. We either have it in many cultures front and center in our lives, perhaps unavoidably, but because those cultures don't have the kind of clinical environments we find ourselves in, where people die in slightly abstract circumstances in hospital wards and then have their bodies whisked away to to cold storage facilities in crematoria or with undertakers. We don't have bodies in our houses. We don't have that experience very much at all. So, dying matters. Dying matters. And there'll be a link at the end of this video and a link on the Facebook posts about this to go and have a look at the Dying Matters web page, which has got all kinds of helpful information about this week. It has some interesting resources to download. There's a whole series of, if I can get my mouse working, a whole series of leaflets to have a look at that are about encouraging us not to be afraid of talking about dying. It doesn't mean we're not afraid of dying. It doesn't mean that at all. But that we're not afraid to talk about dying, or we overcome our fear of what that conversation might feel like or mean. See, every situation I've been in where I've been part of a pastoral moment where people talk about dying, as painful as it's always been helpful. Always been helpful. People are glad that they had that moment, even if they're not glad immediately during it or after. But so often when it comes to conversation after the funeral, in the pub or over coffee or wherever we gather, there are always people who will come, family members who will say to me when I ask how they are and how this has been, I'm so glad we had that conversation. I'm so glad we talked about it. Because it somehow helped them to process and make sense of the death of a loved one. So today's homework is talk about dying. Talk about dying. Again, do it carefully. Do that respectfully. Just make a cup of tea. Wander up to your nearest and dearest and say, can we talk about dying? Maybe talk about the importance of the conversation before you have it and why you'd like to have it and what you fear about it. And if you're not sure what to do or what to say, again, go to the Dying Matters website and have a look at the resources they have. Have a look at the leaflets and let them frame a conversation that is important to have. In our family, we've had limited experience of death so far. My own father died when I was a teenager. My grandparents are all dead. Rebecca's grandmother died just on a year ago, just more than a year ago, and almost exactly a year ago we flew to Germany to say goodbye to her. She was quite matter-of-fact about dying and had said to us for some time, she was a wonderful, just straight as an arrow in terms of what she thought woman. And Mariana said to us, don't come to my funeral, come and see me, but if you want to see me, come and see me before I die, because I would like that better anyway, because I won't be there at the funeral and there's no point you being there. Rather come and see me. So we did. We went to see her and we spent some time with her, and she was very frail and she was in some pain, having struggled with cancer for a very long time. I had a few precious moments alone with her, and I prayed with her because she asked me to do that. And I remember her frankness about her death. She wasn't afraid. She felt clearly that her faith was something she could rest in, and she was able to do that. Not everybody can, but she was able to do that. But we had some very frank conversation about her dying and looking back on her life and the things that she wanted to hold on to and the things, if there were any, that she wanted to let go of. And the list was short, certainly in the latter case. She lived good life. She lived well. She lived courageously. She lived with an open heart. She lived in a real way, if that makes sense. She just was who she was. And you knew that from the beginning. Let's talk about dying. And lastly, I want to say, let's not be afraid of talking about dying with children. Because children need to know that, not just that people die and things die, and as comforting as we think it might be, some caricatured idea about heaven may work for a while, but the deeper questions and their own real sense of grief and fear about dying, especially if they've known someone their own age, or there's a child in their school, or as I dealt with at the university, young people in a community that size die. Let's not underestimate the ability of children to process things in their own way, in their own time, in their own sense. We, before we got our guinea pigs, had a hamster for all of 3 weeks, and it just got more and more ill. over a period of a couple of days, having basically slept all day and played a bit at night, and then it died. And our hamster's buried in our back garden. And there's some daffodils that came up where the hamster was buried. And Lucas talks about it. And he held the hamster for the very first time when it was already dead, before we put it into the little grave. And he references that still. And we go back and we talk about it. It's important. Children can be incredibly matter-of-fact about death. For them, it isn't always as emotional. They want to understand. They have questions about what happens, and sometimes their questions might seem illogical to us, or a bit simplistic or silly even, but they're important for them. When my older two children were small, Hannah was I think 5 and Matthew just 3. We went to a funeral together, the three of us. There was a wonderful woman called Mabel, who'd been the organist, the pianist in one of the churches that I had before I moved into the city of York, when I lived just outside. And Mabel had played with me at the chapel, and Mabel had gone with me into the local school in a village called Wistow every other week to do an assembly with the kids. And we just had a great time. I loved it a bit. She was a wonderful woman. And she died, and I went to her funeral, and it was on a day that I had the children and I was responsible for them, so I took them along. And we went into the church and we waited. It was the Church of England church across the road from the chapel. It was a shared kind of ecumenical church, but the service was in there. Refreshments in the chapel hall. And the service began, and Matthew, being little, got a bit fidgety, so I thought, okay, I'll take him out. So the three of us quietly left and went out into the graveyard of the church. And we wandered around and we were talking about the church and the graveyard and the Mabel. And we found the open grave that had been dug for Mabel. And the kid said to me, "Oh, what's that?" And I said, "That's where Mabel's body's going. Her body's in the coffin. You saw them carrying it in, and her body will be put into the grave, and they'll cover it over and put up a stone and remember her. It'll be a place where the family can come and say, thank you, God, for Mabel, and thank you for who she's been, and talk to her if they like, even if they think she can't hear them, just to do whatever they want to do to remember her." Okay, that's fine. Wandered across, had some cake, got out the way because the family came out for a private interment, so we went across the road to the chapel for tea and cake. We were driving home in the car afterwards, and Hannah said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" So I said, "Sure." She said, "So, if Mabel's body's in the coffin, what have they done with her head?" I said to her, "I don't understand. What do you mean?" And she said, and these were her exact words, she said, "Well, you know, like when you have fish and chips, you get the body of the fish, but there's never the head. The head's already gone. They don't give you the head. So where's Mabel's head? What have they done with it?" She wasn't anxious. She was curious. So I said to her, "No, Hannah, the head's there as well. When I say the body doesn't just mean the body. It means everything." "Okay, that's fine." It was all she wanted to know. And I said to them both, "Do you want to ask me any questions?" Or, No. They were quite okay with it. Sometimes families shield each other. They try to protect each other and other people they love from the realities of dying and the realities of death, especially children. Sometimes families feel they need to be strong around each other in the aftermath of someone dying, or in the course of someone approaching death. They feel that they must somehow be there for each other by somehow trying to be strong, when in fact the best way they can be there for each other will often to be there in their grief and their weakness and their sadness and their fear, because then they get to share that experience in a way that is good for them, even if it doesn't feel good at the time. The other place you might want to look, and I know there was one in our coffee shop in Aroma a couple of times, the Church of England asked if they could use the cafe for a death cafe. And there is a death cafe movement which was begun some time ago. There have been over almost 11,000 death cafes around the world, places where strangers gather to drink tea and eat cake and talk about death. They don't happen often, they don't happen everywhere, but it might be that it would be a good thing for us to think about making part of our life again in some way, in the coffee shop or in the church's life. Find a neutral space and set up a death cafe every now and then, where we're encouraged to be honest about death and dying and talk about it, and to talk about it so that it becomes not normal, but it becomes more acceptable for us to do so. I have lots of stories. I could spend the next half an hour telling you stories about families who talked about death before someone died, and families who didn't talk about death before someone died. And the learning and the wisdom and the experience of people on every side of any of those families as they reflected on what was wise and good to do. The great theme is that I've never been with anybody who has regretted talking about dying, either for themselves or for a loved one. Anyone who's ever felt that it was the wrong thing to have done, to find the courage to open that conversation and to be real about it. And some of it is a very practical conversation about property and passwords and practical arrangements, but so much more importantly, a conversation about the travelling towards and through death, and just how we feel about talking about death in the first place. So that might not seem like the most cheerful thing to begin the week with, but it is a very, very, very important thing. And I want to leave that with you today. Sometimes people ask why there aren't more miraculous healings. Why Jesus didn't heal everybody, why what those healing ministry, what that was about, and what healing ministries look like in the church today. Well, I don't know. That's a topic for another whole long conversation. But I guess the wisest thing I've ever said in that regard is someone once commenting saying, everyone who Jesus healed died. Everyone that Jesus healed died. Death is a certainty. So we don't need to be casual about it. We don't need to pretend it doesn't frighten us. We don't need to try and be brave in ways that deny the reality of what we feel about death. If there is braveness to find, it is to talk about that. And maybe one of the things that the coronavirus epidemic, pandemic, however we want to label it, one of the things that is put on the table for all of us is the fact of death around us all the time. We don't normally have death statistics trotted across our screens and our ears and our eyes every day for months on end. But that's become normal for us, to hear and to see and to know what it is for people to be dying of this disease. But death happens anyway. And we need to talk about it. So I'll put the links up for the Death Cafe website, for the Dying Matters website, for Dying Matters Awareness Week, which begins today and runs for a week, and encourage you all, with those you love and care about, in whatever way is appropriate and makes sense, to start a conversation. Maybe not today, maybe not even this week, but to commit to even the possibility of a conversation about the reality of death. And it's not a propositional conversation about Jesus and faith and heaven and hell. It might be, but that's not fundamentally what we want to talk about. What we want to talk about is what death, the fact of dying, looks like, feels like, as we face it ourselves, as we face the possibility of people we love, as we face the fact of knowing that people we love are going to die. So bless you. The sun is shining. It's a bit windy. I went out on my bike this morning. It was gold, but I made it around a bit slower than usual. Whatever you're going to do today, I hope you have a good day, and let's keep talking about everything. But maybe as part of thinking about this season in our lives and the issues it highlights, let's talk about death. Cheers. See you tomorrow.